Good afternoon to everyone. I am very happy to welcome you back to our series of interviews that I have been doing with prominent people from different spheres and backgrounds from all over the world, internationally known scientists and researchers. And today I am thrilled to be speaking to one of the top scientists on a fascinating subject of a metal that we all know too well, aluminium. In fact, Dr. Christopher Exley is actually known as Mr. Aluminium, and many of you have encountered that, I'm sure, in literature, in the media, and on all social platforms. So I would like to start by welcoming you. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation, because I'm sure that the information that we will discuss will be very useful for pretty much anyone who is interested in this kind of thing and in this kind of research. So would you just give us a bit of the intro, because your field is much more specific to maybe other people that we've had on interviews that is a more broad kind of subject. Just to introduce, what is it exactly that you do and how you came about to do it, and the today of your research and the lab that you conduct at Keele University. What's been happening with that today?
Well, hello, Katia. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk. I think what you've just asked me would probably take about 3 or 4 weeks. You've asked me to tell you the story of my life. So I'll start in 1984, when I first decided to do some research as part of my undergraduate degree. And that research was to try to understand the phenomenon that we called acid rain and why fish were dying in lakes and trees were dying in forests. And I had this inkling from looking at some other people's research that the metal aluminium might be involved. And that's what I did. I looked at aluminium toxicity in fish, and I guess I became obsessed from almost that point onwards, because I then did a PhD in aluminium toxicology, and I then just decided, look, this is not just an interesting metal, this is actually a paradox, because aluminium is the third most abundant element in the Earth's crust. So the thing that we walk on every day is made of 3 elements. Aluminium, silicon, and oxygen. And yet aluminium has absolutely no biological function in anything living today, or as the evidence suggests, in anything that's ever lived. Now, why is that a paradox? Well, because nearly all, virtually all abundant elements are essential or have been essential in some way for biochemical evolution and for living things today. So that became my fascination. Why is aluminium not an essential element? And of course, through starting to research that, you begin to find out, for one thing, well, when aluminium becomes what we call biologically available, it's actually the opposite, of course. It's inimical, it's toxic to almost everything. And so while I started working with fish, you know, I love fish, I was a fisherman. And actually, I really didn't like seeing fish dying in my experiments. And I very quickly moved from working on fish and indeed working on animals to working on humans. And so we brought together, not that I wanted to see humans dying, but we put together a program, and again that program's now been running for over 30 years, essentially called Human Exposure to Aluminium. We wanted to understand the myriad ways that all of us are exposed to aluminium in our everyday life. You know, I write about something called the aluminium age. So that when I went to school, 60s, 70s, in our history lessons, we learned about the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, the Iron Age. Well, the last 120 years has most definitely been the Aluminium Age. And the Aluminium Age has heralded modern life. Without aluminium, we would not have the world we have today. So we mustn't sort of make aluminium the bad guy here. Aluminium has been a wonderful addition to our lives and to all of our lives. But the proviso to that is that when you introduce something new into life, into living things, into humans, you normally assume, and in fact we adopt this policy, that it has been shown to be safe beforehand for that particular application. And that does not apply to any single application of aluminium. We have never demonstrated its safety in any form.
So do I understand correctly that actually there currently, as of today, 2019, there are no peer-reviewed studies that show clearly in a very pragmatic and empirical way that aluminium is safe for human tissues?
Well, putting it in a slightly different way, have there been any studies carried out to show that a particular application of aluminium is safe or not? The answer is that where studies are carried out, and perhaps not with the specific reason of checking its safety, we've always found aluminium to be a problem. It is always a problem. And there's a really good reason why we should all be worried about aluminium in our environment. And that is, well, one of the arguments that used to come from the aluminium industry was that, well, look, it's everywhere, aluminium. It's in the Earth's crust and it's completely inert. The truth is that once aluminium goes out of the Earth's crust and becomes what we call biologically available, it can react in absolutely hundreds of different ways. It is incredibly biologically reactive. It is just that for 99.999% of the Earth's evolution, it was not available. You know, man made aluminium biologically available. Man circumvented the natural process that has kept aluminium out of living things. And he did that by inventing the aluminium age, by making aluminium metal, by making aluminium salts, by using them in myriad different ways. So we now have something which is capable of disrupting almost any biochemical system. You know, a lot of people have a joke with me. They say, you know, something's going wrong. They'll say, oh, Chris will tell you it's aluminium. And then I have to think and take a breath, and I think, well, it could be.
It could be.
And so whenever you start to talk about the possible ways that aluminium can impact, let's say, on human health, they are limitless. It doesn't mean, of course, that it is responsible for a vast array of different health conditions, but it has the potential.
Okay, that's actually very interesting because, as you know, as we all know, there's many discussions going on about the aluminium in, you know, from things such as daily products as people use as deodorants, so something that is applied topically, from, you know, being ingested with food or with water, and going all the way to the, you know, the drugs and the pharmaceutical products, be it, you know, remedies that are supposed to be used for curing or palliating symptoms, or injections such as vaccinations, and, you know, all of this spectrum of things. Somewhere there's always a place for aluminium. So, as you say, many applications. It's interesting to know that in any application that you take, there possibly is a risk of how that application would affect a specific tissue or a specific biochemical process within the body. Actually, now that I've mentioned it, it would be a good idea to maybe give an understanding to people who are not so much into chemistry and who might not understand the detailing of how different compounds and substances work within our body. What would you say about a very common thought of, you know, how we ingest aluminium with food? Because obviously a lot of the food products that we have nowadays that we call food, I wouldn't really call them food, but contaminated with millions of things, including metals, including aluminium. What is the, you know, in general terms, the process that the aluminium goes through when we ingest it through our intestinal system, as opposed to when the aluminium reaches our tissues through, for example, an injection of, you know, a vaccine? Yeah. What is the main difference of how that affects?
First things first, earlier I spoke about something called biologically available aluminium. So let's define that. So really, all of aluminium's deleterious effects, the majority, are brought about by soluble aluminium. So when aluminium dissolves in water, the main solvent, to form something called Al3+, aluminium 3+. Aluminium 3+ is the biologically reactive form of aluminium. So that is what's going to interact with any physiological or biochemical system to produce a detriment. So then think about every other form of aluminium as a vehicle for providing AL3+. And so some forms can provide it very, very quickly, which means that the possibility of toxicity is high. In other circumstances, the release of AL3+ from forms of aluminium may be very, very slow, which again means that the possibility of acute toxicity at least is quite low, or that toxicity is more likely to occur over longer periods of time. So dependent upon the route by which you are exposed to aluminium, this will be really important in terms of the possible either immediate or longer term toxicity. Now, one example you've chosen today I think is a good one to talk about now, because it's actually the subject of a paper I have under review at this moment in time. And the reason I have it reason I wrote this paper was because I became a little bit, let's put it politely, cheesed off with a number of prominent pediatricians continuously saying that the amount of aluminium in a vaccine is, and you know, they seem to revert to sort of baby language. They say it's teeny weeny. They say it's minuscule. Yes. So I thought, well, look, it is true that if you think that there might be 1 milligram of aluminium in a single shot of a vaccine, now 1 milligram is 1,000th of a gram, and most people think, oh, that's teeny weeny, that's really minuscule, that's small. But let's look at that in the context of how an infant might be exposed to aluminium. So an infant, the paper I've written is about, I took the example of a vaccine which is given to an infant at 8 weeks of age called Infandrix Hexa. This vaccine contains 0.82 milligrams of aluminium, less than 1 milligram. Now, I wanted to compare that single exposure of a one vaccine shot to that infant with the other form of exposure, which could be, for example, through breast milk. Right. So let's look at that as a comparison, because that's what we're told. We're told aluminium in the diet is so much more significant than in the teeny weeny amounts that are in vaccines. Well, when you just do some actually relatively simple calculations, what you work out is that one single shot of the vaccine Infandrix Hexa, the amount of biologically available aluminium in that single shot is equivalent to 150 days exposure to aluminium through breast milk. So that, through breast milk, you have a slow exposure over 150 days. So you might think of that as like a chronic exposure to aluminium, whereas a single shot on day 56 of life, it's all in one go. And that is an acute exposure to aluminium. So we're looking at chronic exposure to aluminium in breast milk, and we're looking at acute exposure to aluminium in a vaccine. Now, not only acute in terms of the amount, if we then look at what the concentration of aluminium is in the tissue at a vaccine injection site, well, it is huge. It is a very high concentration. If we compare that concentration to many studies done on cellular toxicity of aluminium, we'll see it's, in many instances, an order of magnitude higher than amounts required to kill cells. So we're talking about an acute exposure, both in terms of receiving a high amount in a very, very short period of time, but also acute because it will kill cells at the injection site. And of course, everyone notices the little red mark and the inflammation you get, and no one thinks anything more about it, that that's all it is. Well, that is cell death. That is the aluminium adjuvant in the vaccine causing cell death. So this teeny weeny amount of aluminium, and that's, remember, one single shot. Children, infants are receiving several vaccines with aluminium in them, and they're having multiple shots of that. Right. So we are talking about, for an infant, that aluminium in a vaccine is an acute exposure. And I believe very strongly that that has not been taken into account in vaccine schedule and programs. And I actually believe that these pediatricians talking about teeny weeny amounts actually believe that.
They do.
They don't have the knowledge otherwise.
Correct.
Exactly. And I'm hoping that when this knowledge is available to them, even though they might not recognize it openly, they will begin to think that perhaps there is, this does need to be taken into account.
Exactly. And this is actually part of the number of reasons why, people like me are doing interviews like this, to get this very specific scientific information that sometimes, you go on the internet or you search or you do research, you don't really know what to hold on to because there's so much information out there, which is why interviews like this is very valuable because you get to have, an input directly from the source of the people who are doing and conducting that research and providing those papers for review, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So when we...
let me just add something to that.
Yes.
So let's just assume that following that acute exposure to aluminium in a vaccine, if the only effect or response to that was a small inflammatory mark at the injection site, I think most of us would go away and think, well, that's probably acceptable. We don't mind that. But you see, what we've found since is that those cells that come into the injection site and survive that exposure, many of them survive it by eating the aluminium.
So
they take it up inside them. And these are the types of cells that have the possibility of going throughout the rest of the body loaded up with aluminium. So our current research is asking the question, when one of these types of cells, and an example of which is something called a macrophage, like a white blood cell, when one of these cells loads up with aluminium, how long is it viable for before the aluminium kills it? And it's looking like, at the moment, minimum weeks and perhaps longer, which means that these cells can go anywhere, including, for example, to an infant's brain. Now, if that cell or cells similar to that come together in an infant's brain, when they die, they will release their toxic load of aluminium into the brain tissue. Now, this experiment, of course, has not been done, nor should it be done, to prove that that is the case. But if you wanted a warning sign, then our recent paper on aluminium in brain tissue in autism should be that warning sign, because we saw those same cells in brain tissue in people who died with autism loaded up with aluminium. Yes. So this is a worry, and this is not about whether or not a vaccine is good or bad. This is simply science. This is what we have found and observed. Yes. And of course it needs future follow-up. We would love to follow up this research.
And this is definitely one of the things that people who do want to provide something for the future benefit of us all should focus on, in terms of, if you want to support research that is dealing with health and specifically, children's health, then these sort of things I find are extremely valuable at this time, especially of such, controversy about this subject. So, by the way, the paper that you just mentioned, I am going to make it exposed to the audience, to the main audience that will be watching this, because it was actually mentioned in one of the discussions already, so hopefully it will reach more and more minds.
And are you talking about the autism paper?
Yes.
Let me tell you a very quick story about that, because obviously this was a mind-changing moment for me, and people who know me probably know that my mind doesn't change that often in such a way. But this research really did make me worry about a possible role for aluminium in autism. And when I presented it in a meeting in Paris, I actually expected the day after that it would be on the 10 o'clock news, that it would be everywhere. It was not picked up by any mainstream news of medium of any sort anywhere in the world. Now, one can wonder why that is the case, but I think we can perhaps guess. But the reassuring thing, perhaps, is that when you look into the statistics on the paper, I think it has now been downloaded from the publisher's website 600,000 times.
Okay.
Now, most people's papers in their lifetime, they might get 10,000 downloads of all of their research put together. So we are looking at a paper that people are reading.
So the information is getting out there, which is the important thing.
You can do through your organization.
And this is exactly what I'm trying to do, because people, as I said before, they sometimes have ideas, you know, they have lobbies on different side of things, but what they truly lack at most times is the basis of information, scientific basis, to conduct any further discussion. And papers like this is exactly something that provides for that. So as we mentioned, vaccines and, you know, how the travel, the intracellular aluminium, and how it can actually cross the blood-brain barrier and end up in the brain, and that might be a red flag to consider for possibilities of autism. Would you then say that this is more of the same line of thought for other conditions such as Alzheimer's or any sort of conditions that affect the brain ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, Alzheimer's is an area that I started working on in the early 90s. So this is something very, very close to our research and my specific interests. And in some ways, the differences I saw in autism made me both understand Alzheimer's and autism better. Now, what we would understand from Alzheimer's is that the main risk factor for Alzheimer's is age, getting old. Why would that be? Well, one possibility is, of course, that you may accumulate aluminium in brain tissue over age, with time. And there's a very good reason for that, is that because the main cells of the brain, the neurons, live for all of our lives. They are essentially immortal cell line in our brain. So they have the possibility of retaining and accumulating aluminium over decades. And that is the mechanism whereby we would potentially expect to see aluminium slowly but surely accumulating, perhaps towards a toxic threshold, when, and we know it's a neurotoxin, that's not in doubt, when it could exert neurotoxicity in the brain. One of the things that made me go from thinking that aluminium might have a role in Alzheimer's disease to actually writing a paper back in 2017 to say that I am absolutely convinced that aluminium has a role in Alzheimer's disease was that we looked at a form of Alzheimer's called familial Alzheimer's disease, where there are known genetic predispositions to the disease and where people get the disease much younger in life,
yes.
40s, 50s.
Which is what has been happening in the recent decades.
Well,
actually.
Yeah, I'll come on to that.
Okay.
So in familial Alzheimer's disease, we know that people get Alzheimer's disease earlier in life, much earlier in life. Sometimes they don't die earlier. They can live into their 70s and 80s with the disease before they die, but they have a predisposition to getting the disease early on. So we looked at the brain tissue from people with familial Alzheimer's disease. And at the time of doing that research, we found the highest concentrations of aluminium we'd ever measured in any brain tissue under any circumstances before in these individuals.
Wow.
Now, again, the only explanation for this, as far as I'm concerned, is that the predispositions to Alzheimer's are predispositions to the early and rapid accumulation of aluminium in brain tissue. So I come to the opinion now, and it's not a widely held opinion, by the way. You will find me ridiculed all over the place for this opinion, that once the aluminium content of brain tissue reaches a certain concentration, a certain amount, it is inevitable that it contributes to the disease. And I'm absolutely convinced that in the normal lifetime of human beings, if there was no aluminium in brain tissue, there would be no Alzheimer's.
Yes, because I even saw you do have an article posted on social media that literally states that you know, without aluminium there is no Alzheimer's.
So it doesn't mean that Alzheimer's disease is necessarily caused by aluminium. Well, what it means is that the Alzheimer's disease that we see today in our lifetimes, we would not see if aluminium was not present, in brain tissue, in human brain tissue.
Interesting.
And you mentioned about the incidence and the nature of Alzheimer's occurring in younger and younger people. Now, these are people who do not have the genetic predispositions, and we have to ask the question, so what is happening? Why is it that people are getting Alzheimer's at a younger age, and it's often a more aggressive form? And I'm just simply going to say that, you know, tomorrow your exposure to aluminium will be higher than it was today. In other words, our exposure to aluminium in our everyday life is burgeoning. It increases day by day. And if it's increasing day by day because of everything that we do, then it will accumulate in our brain tissue earlier, and it will be there at higher amounts. It will be more aggressive in terms of what it's doing. And I'm absolutely convinced that this is the case. So we're not talking about aluminium being the cause of Alzheimer's. We're talking about the fact that without aluminium, the Alzheimer's that we see today, we would not have in our lifetime, in our first 100 years or so of life.
Correct. And as you just mentioned about the growing burden of aluminium in our daily lives, could we then just mention what are the main ways of a human being in an environment of in an urban environment, for example, of exposure? What are the main ways that we do get that metal in our bodies?
Yeah. It isn't absolutely known, though you may read generally that it is, but if I don't know, then no one knows. I'm telling you, and I tell anybody that. Clearly, one area that's obvious is our diet. And when I talk about diet, I really talk about processed food, whether it be food, solid foods, or drinks. Because aluminium is either added to these because it's useful in its many properties that it has.
Such as, just for people to understand.
Well, for example, when in processing, a simple example would be processed cheeses. People probably know a processed cheese is virtually a natural sort of made cheese. And processed cheeses are always perfectly smooth when you cut through them. There are no lumps, nothing there. It's just perfect and smooth. This cannot be achieved in normal cheese making because cheese wants to form lumps and aggregates. So normal cheese would have small holes, little spaces, and even aggregates of cheese. The structure would be crumbly. But if you put aluminium into that process, the aluminium coats all the different individual cheese particles and prevents that from happening to make a nice smooth paste. So it's one example. I mean,
but this just shows, as you know, how many dozens of uses it can have,
absolutely.
You know, for the purpose of
There's
presentation.
also a great deal of aluminium packaging used.
Yes, foils.
In food, in drinks, aluminium cans.
Oh, yes.
You know, whatever anybody tells you, if you're having a drink from an aluminium can, you are getting an extra dose of aluminium. They will tell you, oh, it's got an inner layer on the inside.
And then it's not heated, and then it's not this.
It's just rubbish, okay?
This is very interesting because I sometimes, you know, I have a webinar that is called Detox when I talk about, you know, how to stimulate detox pathways, et cetera, et cetera. And I do talk about the cutlery that we use at our home, what we cook in, literally, and, you know, all of the, obviously, aluminium things that we use for cooking that I suggest that it might be a good idea to substitute it for glass or for, you know, things that are different. And definitely not to cook in foil, you know, people who love to do some baking of, you know, fish or whatever, putting it in foil. Then the argument that I hear is, okay, fair enough, but that's when you heat it. What about if you just put something in foil and you put it in the fridge and then, you know, it doesn't go a temperature change, then it doesn't really leak aluminium into the substance, does it?
Yeah, I mean, aluminium foil we use it in my house, but as you just mentioned, I would never use it, you know, en papillote. I would never cook in it so that the juices of some food mingle with the aluminium, because anyone can then see for their own eyes that the aluminium is corroded by that process, which means that aluminium has come from the foil into your food. But if you wrap a sandwich in it, it's not going to be a problem.
Okay.
You know, if you use it over the top of your roast to prevent the roast getting a little bit, that isn't probably not a problem. So you don't need to become, you know, too fastidious about this or too alarming about it. But like with anything, there are certain circumstances. Obviously, things that are acidic, you should always avoid contact with aluminium. So never use any sort of aluminium saucepans or anything of that sort for boiling anything which is going to be acidic or anything of that sort, because you will, without any question, get an extra dose of aluminium. You know, we've talked about food. You know, the air that we breathe outside on the streets, these particulates that are very, very topical at the moment. And, you know, here in London, the mayor is very much trying to make them the subject of all sorts of legislation and change policy. We're talking about allergy. These are made of aluminium, by the way, most of these particulates. Some of them that are coming perhaps from from exhausts might be carbon-based, but the majority of small particulate materials are aluminium-based. And are they getting lodged in lungs and other surfaces? Are they responsible for some of the inflammation you see in things like allergies and asthmas and stuff like that? Who knows? Because we'd like to do those sorts of experiments more to find that out. The medications that we are taking are, sometimes aluminium is added to those. And of course, some of them are aluminium based, like antacids when you've got acid reflux.
Yes.
Some people must suffer really badly from acid reflux, and you know what, aluminium compounds are the very best things to take those symptoms away. But do you want to take it? You've got to make that decision, because without question that will be adding a body burden to your body burden of aluminium.
And as I always say again, you know, to my audience, it might be a good idea for the, you know, for taking care of the symptoms, but then there's a broader subject of whether you want to actually remedy the symptoms or look at the root cause of why you have that condition to begin with, which is a probably much wiser approach to what's happening to your body.
The wellness approach is one that no one is adopting in the main, apart from people like yourselves. I mean, our NHS is all about selling drugs for disease.
Not only your NHS, it's probably a general standard procedure all over the world.
It's not about how to be well.
Yes.
And if we changed you know, the whole dogma on this, if we changed to being how to be well, things would change very, very quickly. I'm absolutely sure of it. But of course, I don't know. Well, at the moment, the money is to be made on being ill. But I'm pretty confident that most entrepreneurs could make money out of being well too.
If they would just change the dogma and the paradigm in their mind. Which is, I think, you know, people like you, people like other scientists who provide this sort of information, feed it into the public constantly. I think eventually the overall volume of it will be so strong that at some point there will be more interest in actually switching the paradigm, hopefully. But coming back to exposures to aluminium, so we did mention diet and we did mention air and pollution, probably water as well. What about, there's a lot of questions about cosmetic products. And one in particular, which is, you know, now it's a lot of women are interested in this question because there's now this new wave of, you know, organic, bio, etc. products available as a substitution for something that was more toxic before. So then in the example of deodorants that used to be the culprit of, you know, the typical deodorant that you would not use because it contains aluminium. So now they substituted it with the mineral salt kind of deodorant, which then has the aluminum salt in it. So the question that nobody really knows the answer to, is that the same thing? Is that not the same thing? Does it affect?
Listen, first of all, let's get the nomenclature right, okay? Aluminium is an antiperspirant. So deodorants should simply be something which masks smell and just a perfume of some sort. Now, you can buy deodorants, but most deodorants you buy are antiperspirant deodorants. Now, the antiperspirant is the aluminium, and you know what? There is no product better than aluminium at killing, which is what really is going on, inhibiting your sweat gland. It's not a blocking or anything rubbish like that Unilever will tell you, or any of these major manufacturers. It is literally inhibiting the activity of a really important gland called the sweat gland. Now, so that is, you think about that with respect to antiperspirants, you then think, right, it's doing two things. It's inhibiting a very important gland. That gland, yes, we all know it because it produces sweat, but it's actually important for a lot of other physiological processes. There's also an interest because we adventitiously get rid of aluminium from our body, mainly in our urine, but mostly recently our research has shown also in our sweat. So sweating is a really good way of getting rid of aluminium. It might even be more important than in urine. Now, if you then are applying an antiperspirant in a certain area of the body, let's in the underarm region, so you are blocking, first of all, the activity of a sweat gland. Some of the aluminium you apply can get into the surface layers of the skin and beyond. Some of it, a tiny proportion, because you're actually applying a lot of aluminium when you apply an antiperspirant. But it's also stopping the aluminium that's already in the tissue getting out.
Oh, right.
So you have a double sort of effect there. Now, there has been a connection with aluminium antiperspirants and breast cancer, and it's been one that we've worked on for a while, and it's been one where it's been equivocal. We're not quite sure one way or another, but actually there was a beautiful piece of research conducted by an Austrian group, which was published just a couple of years ago, on the largest study of its kind, which essentially made the very, very strong connection, which was saying that frequent use of an antiperspirant in young people, I think the age was under 20s, there was a very strong link with breast cancer.
Right.
Now, this, I think you can take that as a sort of, almost we were talking previously about acute versus chronic. You can take that as the sort of acute exposure via an antiperspirant, regular use, more than once a day in young people, and very strong link in later life with breast cancer. But then it also rests, if you then are using that particular product over many, 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 many years, it can also mean that there will be a connection there. So for a long time, I've not had a strong opinion one way or another about antiperspirants, aluminium and breast cancer, and now I'm going along the line that I do believe there is a role for aluminium in breast cancer. So cosmetics, certainly the antiperspirants, this is something that we need to at least to think about. We need to think about how often we use them, perhaps.
There are quite a few alternatives now. They're not as effective. They're not as, as we were saying about
they're not as convenient,
not as convenient, etc. But there are, and as I was asking you about one, which is the salt crystal, is that a good enough alternative?
This is a marketing sham.
Great, we have it now said.
What do they call them? Crystal or something is the name they use for them.
Well, it just looks like crystal,
but they actually use that, I believe, and they are aluminium sulfate. Hang on a minute, it's aluminium sulfate. Why does it work? Because it's got aluminium. How does it work? Because it dissolves, and the Al3+, remember, inhibits the sweat gland. That's why it works. It's no different to the aluminium chlorohydrate, which is in the conventional antiperspirant. So, don't make that distinction.
This is a great example of how, the business of things is actually a very witty instrument to be playing around with how they switch you from one market to another market niche, and you are happily residing in that niche.
The crazy marketing of these crystal deodorant people is they say things like, yes, but the alum particles are too big to get through the pores of the skin. I mean, there's no science in this whatsoever. but people believe it, of course. And why? Let's be honest. Exactly. Why wouldn't you believe? You do not expect somebody to be telling you lies, and you do not expect them to be trying to deceive you into buying their product. Maybe
Although
we should,
it's sort of, although it's amazing how human psychology works, because on one hand we all understand that that's exactly what's happening, but when it comes to a specific product, not in this case, kind of thing.
I mean, the reason why the antiperspirant industry continuously tells everybody that they work by blocking the sweat gland is because that means it's only a cosmetic.
Yes.
If they were to admit, which actually everybody knows, and I don't understand why this has not happened, but if they were to admit that it works by inhibiting the sweat gland, it would be a medicine, and it would have to go through all the regulations that medicines have to go through. But, you know, I've Unilever have had me in their headquarters and places on their sort of brainstorming, because they would love to find an alternative to aluminium
because
in antiperspirants. And, you know, right now they haven't. But, you know, maybe we've got time in this interview, because there is good news for all of us with respect to how we can protect ourselves against our everyday exposure to aluminium.
Oh, well, lovely.
Yeah.
Good news is always a
Because,
good idea.
You know, one of the things that I tell people, I'm having a sip of water here, but this water is not part of the good news, but water is. One of the things I say to everybody is, look, you know, Chris has worked in aluminium for 35 years, and I can't avoid aluminium in my everyday life. And you know what? Sometimes I don't want to avoid it. I know it's in the wine that I love, so I'm drinking my wine. There are things that I do where I know I am exposing myself to aluminium. I do actually make most attempts to, you know, where I know not to do that, but I don't want to make my life a misery. But luckily, going back to my early work on fish, I was able to show back in the late 80s that you could completely protect against the toxicity of aluminium by introducing another element into the equation, and that element is the second most abundant element in the Earth's crust, silicon. Now, there's a clue here, because the Earth's crust is made of aluminium, silicon, and oxygen, and it's non-toxic. Right. So when you put the silicon back with the aluminium, you produce no toxicity. And I was able to do that with fish. I was able to show that by putting silicon back into a system, the aluminium was totally non-toxic and the fish were perfectly happy. So one of the things that came from that, and I've spent 30 years elucidating the chemistry, the detailed chemistry of this, and I'll be giving a talk on this in Berlin next month. Mm-hmm. But what came from it is that if you drink something, and we first saw this in drinking beer. Beer has quite a high level of silicon, and the form of silicon that is in beer is its soluble form called silicic acid. And silicic acid is this wonderful molecule. It's a silicon atom surrounded by 4 OH groups, and it appears to have almost no chemistry. It has no organic chemistry and almost no inorganic chemistry, except it reacts with aluminium. Nothing else. No other metals, like no other organic molecule. It's almost like fate, isn't it? Like it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be, of course. Silicon is the reason why aluminium has not been involved in biochemical evolution, because it wasn't available, because silicon kept it locked up. So silicic acid, if you drink something with a high amount of silicic acid in, what we observed was you produce aluminium in your urine.
You could, the detox pathways.
It's a pathway of removing aluminium from the body. And so clearly we can't really get people to drink lots and lots of beer. So what's the next best thing? And we looked at water, and we looked at mineral waters. And we started to look at varying mineral waters, and those that had a particular high content of silicon or silicic acid, anything above 30 ppm, 30 milligrams per litre, were very effective in removing aluminium from your body.
Right.
So I drink a silicon-rich mineral water, about a litre of it, every day.
Wow.
And that is what I tell anybody who asks me, how can I at least... We don't know that it's going to give 100% protection, because we haven't been able to do the research to demonstrate that. But for example, we've done clinical trials in people with Alzheimer's disease and shown that people with Alzheimer's disease improve cognitive function by simply drinking a silicon-rich mineral water.
I believe there is a similar belief for patients with autism. or kids with autism, that now there are a few.
And lots of anecdotal
There's a
stuff
yoni. There's also anecdotal stuff, but that's my question. I guess there is that actually applicable to what you're saying, because I believe there's a few brands of just water that they're trying to use that supposedly have, but they do say that it has a high content of silica in order to help with detoxifying.
I mean, probably emanating from our research, but I know of Facebook groups and others where people are introducing silicon-rich mineral waters to their infant or their child's everyday, and they are seeing some remarkable changes. Yes. Now, none of this is science, of course. This is all anecdotal, but at the end of the day, what you really want to do is for people to be better. So yes, I would love to be able to do a clinical trial, to demonstrate one way or another that regular drinking of silicon-rich mineral water, for example, could prevent Alzheimer's disease, or could help infants or people with autism, or as we've also done a clinical trial, people with multiple sclerosis, where aluminium is definitely involved. Again, autoimmune diseases, aluminium seems to have a role in autoimmune diseases. So that does need to be done, simply from the point of view of convincing all and sundry and authorities and everywhere else that this is a way forward. But of course, knowing that getting the funding to do that sort of research is incredibly difficult for someone like me, then I just tell people, look, just do it and keep me in touch. And I literally have people emailing me on a weekly basis about these sorts of things. And obviously most of the people who email are always telling me good things. So I don't know that everyone is experiencing good news.
Yes.
But people who want to let you know are always telling you good news. It makes sense. I know that if you drink a silicon-rich mineral water every day, you not only protect yourself against your exposure to aluminium during that day, but you will be removing aluminium.
So this is a form of a very sort of healthy and non-aggressive way of chelating aluminium out of the body.
What I want to try to do, and people like you can help, is to take this out of the detox scenario, though, and put it into as a philosophy for life. Because if you cannot decide to do this for a few months and then stop.
Oh, no.
This is not something where you will get rid of all your aluminium, because the next day you'll start filling back up again. In other words, it's got to be a philosophy in life. And
well, the truth is, at least in the message that I try to spread among the people who read my work, is actually, it is under the frame of detox, but I do try and tell people that detox is a continuous process in the conditions that our life is right now. So it's not something you do for 2 weeks, a marathon, you drink a bunch of juices and then you're done. It's a constant consciousness about what you surround yourself with, what you ingest, what you put on your skin, and just generally, how you live, even if we only focus at the moment on the the physiological side of things. But that it is a continuous process.
So it's part of your everyday life, and that's what I say to people: make it part of your everyday life. Our clinical trials have run for 12 weeks. So those are as long as we've been able to afford to run. And in both multiple sclerosis, in Alzheimer's disease, and in healthy volunteers, we've been able to show in every case that you see increased excretion of aluminium in the first instance once you start to drink the silicon-rich mineral water. And over time, we see that going down. And we interpret that as a reflection in the body burden going down.
Yes.
Because urinary excretion of aluminium is probably the only reliable way of estimating someone's body burden. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. People want to use hair or blood or nails, or unfortunately the science of all of those is not sufficiently well advanced to be able to say, to take say a hair analysis and use the data to say that is indicative of your body burden of aluminium. We cannot do that. I know that you can buy tests on this and people will offer to do it.
Yes.
But you cannot.
This is very interesting, precisely because I, as a person who have been trained in integrative medicine and functional medicine, this is kind of the typical approach that we are led to believe that, you know, this combination of tests will give you this sort of information on that sort of thing. And precisely when we speak about metals, hair mineral analysis is the first thing to go to, as opposed to, for example, stress tests that are conducted to see the blood level or the urine level. And in fact, when it comes to metals, there is a belief that, you know, stress tests first not only cause redistribution of metals that might be, you know, that oxidizes more cells in the process, and you make yourself more vulnerable, and then at the same time, as you measure those levels, that is not really indicative of anything, because nobody knows what is the individual case of how much you release with that stress test and how fast will it go down. So it's kind of unmeasurable. And they say, well, in the hair mineral test, what you see is what is in the tissue, so it's kind of a more stable sign of that burden over a period of time. So if that is not the case, that would be very interesting to know, because then the whole...
Well, yeah, I mean, we have begun, started and looked at hair analysis with respect to aluminium, and we have not been able to get data which support its use at the moment. So we cannot get data which, for example, correlate with urinary aluminium excretion or anything of that sort. It's also, again, I say this to everybody, and I get lots of people emailing, asking me, how do I measure my body burden of aluminium? How do I know? I tell them, you can't actually. Because even I, in my lab, you know, we can do it, and it's a relative measure. Because we've got hundreds and hundreds of data points for people now, we can put your data against those and tell you whether or not it looks like you have more than you should have. It's not a quantitative, it's a relative amount. And that's, you know, the best lab in the world. That's what we are in measuring things in human tissues. That's what we can achieve. So that's why I tell people, actually just drink a silicon-rich mineral water.
Just know
that the science tells you that you will be getting rid of it by doing that. And you know, one of the problems with chelation per se is that it's pretty non-selective. Yeah. Now, the beauty of a silicon-rich mineral water is that silicic acid reacts with only one metal, aluminium. So no other metal is affected. So we have data, for urinary excretion data for copper, for iron, and a few other things which show that these are not affected at all by drinking a silicon-rich mineral water, at least not directly. There's some evidence, of course, that if you start to remove aluminium from the body, and aluminium might be influencing another metal homeostasis in the body, then you can see that effect. In other words, that's a positive effect in some reasons. You're taking away something that aluminium was doing, and that's then being reflected in the parameters that you measure. But these are, you know, tentative. Okay. So your silicon and silicic acid only reacts with aluminium. It will not, you know, I get, oh, what about mercury? Will it take out mercury? No, it won't touch anything else. But that's good news, because the majority of other, including historically, if you have had an intoxication of aluminium, and it does happen periodically for different reasons in different individuals, we would have used an iron chelation agent called DFO, desferrioxamine, to help remove aluminium from the body. But of course, it gets rid of iron, so you've got to take iron supplements. And you will see research on things like EDTA. Yes. Might mean something to you. Yes. And of course, EDTA will bind virtually all divalent metals, and aluminium only very loosely. So you are risking, I believe, major disruptions to essential metal homeostasis in some forms of chelation therapy. So that must really, and I know that therapists who do this do take this into account, but perhaps not all are paying enough attention to that. And it's one thing saying, well, yeah, you're going to lose a lot of magnesium in your urine because we're chelating this, that, and the other, and you can just take some magnesium tablets. No. I think we all know that you can't simply take a supplement and replace what's lost. Yes. This is not something that is straightforward. It's not just one in and out. It's much more complicated than that.
Yes. And this is actually, this brings me to a question that I had before when we were speaking about how the aluminum being detoxed from the body with the urine. And then I immediately thought about, okay, so how do we protect the tissues of, you know, the whole urinary tract and the kidneys as we start having that flow, increasing flow of the ions, you know, leaving the body? Is there any suggestion, you know, for example, a person starts drinking this water in large amounts every day and this flow starts, how do we, you know, what is the best way, considering what you just said about supplements, that it's not that easy to just take something in to replace something is lost or to protect something? Is this about more antioxidants? What is the best solution to protect the pathways as this is happening in your body? Is there a need to protect those pathways?
You know, what's interesting again is that in all the clinical trials that we've run using silicon-rich mineral waters, we've had almost no reported side effects. However, we do get reported side effects from people simply taking my advice. And we get some of those are consistent in terms of we do get similar. So we get situations where people talk about maybe initially a form of nausea, or quite often effects on the stool, which is interesting, and I take that as a very positive thing, because I really believe that while silicon as silicic acid going into the blood is important, what it does in the gut is also very important before going through into the body. Now, why would any of these things be? Well, it's not impossible that if you have a high body burden of aluminium, and once you start to release that from the tissues, you will get a transient increase in the amount of aluminium in your bloodstream, and it's not impossible that that could produce some sort of side effect. So I don't rule that out. And anybody who asks me about this, I said, well, how much are you drinking? Let's cut it down. Or how are you drinking it? So people say, well, do I need to drink a litre at once? And I say, well, no, you know, drink a few hundred mils on a regular basis throughout the day, and that'll give you your full litre for the day. And we change the way in which, and often that tends to have beneficial effects. But yes, there are possibilities of unusual side effects, but they're pretty rare. And as I said, in none of our clinical trials, dealing with some pretty ill people actually with Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis and others, and many healthy volunteers, we haven't seen them. But in individuals reporting back to me via email, we do get them. But in terms of, you know, aluminium is not useful in your body at all. You and I would be different people today without the aluminium in our body. We would probably have a whole lot more energy, for starters, because the body uses up energy dealing with biologically reactive aluminium, which it cannot use in any possible and beneficial way. So again, you know, I talk about silicon-rich mineral waters as being for health reasons, just general health. Yes, it may protect against neurodegenerative diseases in the future. It may help with respect to conditions like autism in susceptible individuals. But general health of individuals, I believe, will be better if they have less aluminium in their body.
Correct. And actually, one of the questions that I now had listening to you speak about aluminium leaving the body with the help of silica. So does that bond actually have a time frame, as in a half-life of when it sort of breaks and then the aluminum is found free floating again and the body needs to take it back into somewhere and store it away from?
It's a great question. And as with all great questions, there's never going to be a good answer to those. So we understand the chemistry of what we call the reactions of silicic acid with aluminium. They form something called a hydroxyaluminosilicate. We understand this in aqueous, in water, beautifully, and published on it and demonstrated it. What is happening in the blood, we have not been able to do anything on that. We'd like to, actually, and we'd like to be able to. We may need to use a combination of computational chemistry and bench chemistry to achieve that. What we believe happens is that in the blood, at any one moment in time, aluminium is present in a form which we call aluminium hydroxide, which is when aluminium has come out of solution, but is still almost in a sort of semi-soluble form. It's very, very tiny. We know that silicic acid can react with that and form a complex which is small enough to be filtered by the kidney. Now, of course, let's say that it gets to the kidney within a few milliseconds, which is what would normally happen. Then it's already been removed and the job has been done. But if it lasts a few minutes, let's say, or even a few seconds, those complexes forming in the blood may not be sufficiently strong to be held together under those circumstances. And you have to wait for the next pulse of silicic acid to come in to start to take them away. Because the reason why we say a silicon-rich mineral water is that when you drink a silicon-rich mineral water, silicic acid immediately follows water into your blood. So almost the concentration of silicic acid in the mineral water is the concentration in your blood. And that is sufficient to grab hold of the aluminium and keep it for long enough to help it to be filtered by the kidney. There's some interesting research from France looking at Alzheimer's disease. Well, in the first instance, they wanted to look at, is there any correlation between, or is there any change in the incidence of Alzheimer's disease relative to the amount of aluminium in the drinking water? And they found a very sort of weak association. It was still positive, so higher aluminium meant a slightly higher incidence of Alzheimer's. But if they changed their research philosophy and looked at concentration of silicon in the drinking water and incidence of Alzheimer's disease, they then got a beautiful reverse relationship. High silicon, the incidence of Alzheimer's disease went down about 5 times.
Wow.
Now, this is simply in waters where, in the majority of cases, they're not silicon rich, but it shows that a background of silicic acid is helpful. But if you want to be, if you want to have the gold star protection, yes, you probably need to drink a silicon-rich mineral water. Right. There are places in the world, and it's again very difficult to get absolutely pure facts about this, but there are places in the world where the concentration of silicic acid or silicon in the natural waters, in the drinking waters, are naturally high because of, for example, high volcanic activity. So Japan would be one example. Right. And so Japanese people have are naturally exposed to higher levels of silicic acid. They have one of the lowest incidences of Alzheimer's disease in any developing country.
That is very interesting.
Malaysia, where we get one of our silicon-rich mineral waters from for our trials, similarly has many natural waters high and rich in silicon, and they have also a very low incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Now, is this just pure sort of correlation, or is there something happening here? I would like to suspect that there is something happening here. Where you live does affect your tendency to get a particular disease or not.
It would actually be interesting to see if there are any studies that we can compare and see how, because you just mentioned Alzheimer's, but what about autism in those regions?
Yeah.
The vaccine schedule in the Western world, even though this is the case of Asia, but it's sometimes even more fierce and aggressive at times. I don't know right now by heart the vaccination schedule of Malaysia or Japan, but I do know that Japan has delayed the schedule of vaccination, much more kind of spread out, etc. So that is one of the factors, obviously, that's affecting the intake of things into the body. But also, if we know that the silicon, the naturally occurring silicon in the water has the correlation on Alzheimer's that way, it would be interesting to see if that is the case with the autism as well.
As you point out beautifully, there are always many more questions and many more research objectives once you start to have this sort of discussion. And, that's what wakes me up in the morning and keeps me going, because the possibility of doing some of these types of things. At the moment, we do very, very simple, straightforward research, trying to answer the most straightforward questions, like I just mentioned previously. How long does a macrophage full of aluminium live? You'd think we'd know that, wouldn't you? You'd think somebody would have done that already. But actually, these have not been done. So, we try to concentrate our efforts at the moment on that, and largely because, our funding is extremely limited. We do not get funding from the government, from major charities, from any industry. In the last 5 years, 90% of our research has been funded by philanthropy. And, hallelujah for that.
Yes.
That is what is keeping us going. But of course, this is a sort of a tenuous way to keep a research program going,
yes.
as we're finding out at the moment.
That is very true, and this is why also, people like myself would always try and invite more and more people to get involved, not only in reading the final paper, but actually kind of standing behind the whole movement of helping scientists, helping independent universities and laboratories to conduct that research, not today, not tomorrow, but in the long run as well,
Sure.
because, if the funding is gone in a month, then that's about it we have.
There are many people, some of which may actually watch and listen to your video, who could, if they wanted to, change the world. And, I am possibly a snake oil salesman, or I am real, and everybody has to make their own opinion on that. Look into me, see who I am, make an opinion on that. But I believe that with a few $1 million, we can do experiments on, for example, Alzheimer's or autism. And those experiments will change the world. They will change the world.
This is a very beautiful and important message, and I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of individuals who will be watching this video, and I will definitely ensure that this video gets to the individuals that might not watch it as a free broadcast, but who will have the opportunity to get this
It's a serious thing. Many people have a lot of money, and many people use it in brilliant ways.
But many people don't know that there are other ways.
Truly change things.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about, in the world of clinical trials, we are as cheap gets. The amount of money, Alzheimer's is a beautiful example. Billions of dollars have been spent on Alzheimer's trials, and not a single one has worked. In 40 years, we still don't have a single drug for Alzheimer's that has any benefit for people with Alzheimer's, and we've spent billions and billions and billions of dollars.
So just a very small ratio of that amount that, directed in another way would have been actually much more.
Well, we're going to ask that question. Is aluminium involved in Alzheimer's, yes or no? We can do that experiment now. We know how to do it. Is aluminium implicated in autism, yes or no? We can do that experiment.
Science is not settled on that, by the way.
Science is definitely not settled. So these are experiments. When I say change the world, it's not only changing the world because it will influence people who have these conditions.
No.
It will also cause world stock markets to crash because aluminium is implicated in every single thing that we do. Now, what we shouldn't be afraid of, we shouldn't think that this will then demonize aluminium. What it will tell us is we must live in the aluminium age. It's a wonderful age. We must simply learn when we need to and how we need to use it safely and effectively.
Yes, and adapt our way of life to it so that we benefit to the maximum.
Yeah. Why do we put a teeny weeny amount of aluminium in a vaccine? Why do we do that?
Why do we do that? That's actually one of the questions.
To save money.
To save money.
Because without that aluminium teeny weeny amount in the vaccine, the antigen in that vaccine would not work at all.
The immune system response, you
there
mean?
There would be no immune response at all.
So actually what is good, and this is just a clarification for anyone who is watching, when you do inject anything that is related to a virus with a vaccine, the result of the immune response that's being created is actually due to the adjuvants, which is mainly the question of parents that sometimes see the excipients table and they say, but why is all of that in there? Why don't they just do, well, this is why, because the response is actually created by a very, a highly toxic substance that is producing that effect on the immune system and not the virus.
Think of it like a catalyst. It catalyzes a reaction that otherwise would be so low you would not get any immunity. So aluminium is acting as a catalyst. In fact, that's one of the ways in which aluminium is used in everyday life in myriad other ways. So, but do we need, I am not even of a mind that we shouldn't use aluminium compounds in vaccines. I believe it's possible to have safe vaccines which include aluminium compounds. It's just that we do not need this teeny weeny amount. We actually do need a teeny weeny amount. In other words, they can be properly engineered to be safe, or at least a lot safer than they are today.
Okay.
Now, that might be a better way forward than trying to look for alternatives, because every alternative adjuvant will have complications.
Correct.
They may not be as severe as I believe those to do with aluminium are, but they could be, and you only find that out, of course, by trying out new adjuvants, which should, in theory, mean new clinical tests, and that can take many years in order to bring those to fruition.
And that's not normally what the pharmaceutical
and why do it when you don't have to?
Exactly.
The cost of the aluminium salt in a vaccine is zero. So if it's Gardasil is £500 a shot, the cost of the aluminium in there is 0 pence. It has no cost, and without the 0 pence aluminium, it doesn't work. So why are they going to change when they don't have to? They all of a sudden can charge £500 for a vaccine that doesn't work by adding something to it which costs nothing. So why is that Merck going to change that vaccine? They are not, unless there's legislation to force them to do so.
Unless there's legislation, and unless there's finally some sort of a thorough investigation into why, actually, speaking of Gardasil, that particular vaccine is being proved to be so highly problematic, just in terms of the statistics of the side effects and the...
Yeah, it's the highest rate.
It is just crazy.
2.5%.
Yeah,
by Merck's own figures.
Exactly, and that are not, we're not taking that as a final number.
No.
So, wow, well, it does seem that there's a lot of field, probably much more than has already been done, but that's actually exciting. And I think the message for today that we will take away is that there is a lot that we already know and that we can already apply even in our everyday life, such as a beautiful, suggestion that is very accessible to everyone. And I'm pretty sure that people will take it in gladly, because it's something that we all have the power to do. But at the same time, there's much more that we can do still, and also through, standing behind research like the one that is being conducted by the lab of Christopher Exley in our case today, just really, being conscious about that this is the world that we live in, and we do affect how it carries on into tomorrow for ourselves, for our kids, whether it be the immunization schedule of our children, or the food that we eat, or the air that we breathe, or if something cannot be remedied straight away and directly, what sort of paths can we take to balance itself out for ourselves, as you well said, to enjoy the aluminum age.
Absolutely.
And to make it beneficial and minimize our risks. So
can I add a small little antidote to that?
Yes.
Which, at one of my meetings that we organised, called the Keele Meetings on Aluminium, a few years ago now, we had a representative from the aluminium industry there. And they made some sort of comment from the floor when I was chairing a session. And I simply said to them, I said, I love aluminium. Aluminium has brought me my career. Look around you. All of these people, they love aluminium. They work with it. They want to understand it. They want to know more about it. What are you doing? And, this was enough to silence the person from industry, because they're not doing anything. Or if they are, they're keeping it to themselves. So we are not against aluminium. We absolutely appreciate the value that aluminium has given us. The advent of modern life has been brought about due to the aluminium age. But we must not be complacent about it, and we must absolutely ensure that every time we use aluminium, we use it not only effectively, but safely.
Safely. That is the bottom line of every thing that is now, related to our health, actually. Safety first.
Yeah.
Chris, thank you very much for today.
Pleasure.
It was a wonderful talk. I'm sure that it will be very interesting for pretty much anyone to watch, because this is a lot of information to digest and to kind of get your head around. But thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for watching as we head on to our next series, and good day to all.